The British Army is accused of allowing its soldiers to kill unarmed civilians. The new report details atrocities in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm Adnan Nawaz. Today's Newsmaker is the UK's rules of engagement. Two British soldiers stationed in southern Iraq were reportedly given permission to shoot anyone holding a mobile phone, carrying a shovel, or acting in any way that seemed suspicious. These loose rules of engagement are also alleged to have led to the deaths of children in Afghanistan. A report by Middle East Eye says the deaths were covered up, with soldiers talking about weapons being planted on dead bodies, officers assuring their subordinates they'd be protected. The fog of war causing collateral damage is one thing, but commanders giving soldiers what amounts to a license to kill innocent people is another thing entirely. And if that's what happened, who in Her Majesty's Armed Forces knew about it? Haider Abbasi begins our conversation with this report.
It's been years since British forces have been in active combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, but both campaigns continue to haunt people who were involved. Several ex-servicemen have spoken out to make an astonishing claim: that they were given license to kill unarmed civilians.
We were shooting old men, young men. This is what I witnessed. I've never seen such lawlessness.
They say they were permitted to shoot anyone suspected of surveilling them in Iraq and Afghanistan. The British Army calls them spotters or dickers, men who inform militants of the movements and whereabouts of foreign forces. But in a report by the news website Middle East Eye, these former soldiers say they often shot people without verifying if they were dangerous.
Anyone you deem is a terrorist, you shoot them. But how could we know if they were a threat? Not all of them were dickers. Some were just people holding phones.
Their officers reportedly told them they'd be protected if they were ever investigated for killing civilians. Britain joined a US-led coalition that invaded Iraq in 2003. The US accused Baghdad of possessing weapons of mass destruction. Most British forces were deployed in the southern city of Basra, and they remained in control there for almost 5 years. Britain still has more than 500 soldiers in Iraq, but they're there only to train and advise the Iraqi military. Allegations about unlawful killings and abuse by British soldiers in Iraq aren't new. In 2010, the British government set up the Iraq Historic Allegations Team to investigate suspected abuses by UK armed forces. It received 3,400 allegations of unlawful killings and mistreatment. The government paid out millions of dollars to Iraqis tortured by British soldiers. Apart from the allegations of killing unarmed civilians, former British soldiers say they witnessed cover-ups. One account suggests Soviet-era guns were planted next to the bodies of 2 unarmed Afghan boys killed by British forces. Will the UK government launch an investigation based on this latest report? And will its soldiers be held to account for extrajudicial killings? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's now go to our guests in London. Alex MacDonald is a journalist who contributed to the Middle East Eye report. Alex has also filed his own stories on this topic. We're also joined by the retired British Army officer and security analyst Charles Shoebridge. Alex, Charles, thank you very much indeed for your time. Charles, the question has to go to you about the credibility of the report as far as you see it. Do you believe it?
Yes, I do believe it. First of all, I know the British Army very well. I was in the British Army, a member of the British Army for 8 years. This isn't to say that I saw wanton law breaking, but soldiers will be soldiers, and it means that a small proportion of those, possibly a small proportion of those, will take advantage of any relaxation of the rules that govern their conduct, even in combat zones. And I think that's covered very clearly by the Middle East Eye report. Also, of course, the journalists that contributed to this report, of course, your other guests, but also Ian Cobain, are highly credible, I believe, in my experience of following them over a number of years, certainly Ian Cobain. And it strikes me that this is a well-balanced report. It gives both sides of the story. And I think that the account is credible, not least, of course, because it relies upon in some cases named witnesses, in other cases witnesses who understandably wouldn't want to give their names, but actually who are soldiers themselves. And I suspect if court proceedings were ever to result from this, which I think we're going to come on to later on possibly, they, of course, could be required to give evidence in this case. So, no, it doesn't surprise me at all. And but what does surprise me, of course, is that with the exception of yourselves and a couple of other people, this has attracted relatively little coverage in the British media. That's to say, since this Middle East report, report arose, there's been almost no coverage of it. And of course, you would expect, of course, cynics wouldn't expect, but others might expect that certainly the liberal media might have covered this in more detail.
Yeah, we'll certainly come on also to the fact that this particular government that's in power in the UK at the moment has spoken out against human rights lawyers who have been trying to bring some of these cases to people's attention, as well as the media doing that. Alex, there are no named sources in either piece written by you or by Ian, who wrote the original piece. And some of the stories are not independently verified. Are you able to tell us anything about any of the regiments that may have been involved, about the soldiers, and whether they're former soldiers, whether they are current soldiers? Why were they concerned, if they were former soldiers, about keeping their names anonymous?
Well, I mean, I really wouldn't want to go into the background details of the people that Ian interviewed. I mean, the first, just to clarify, the first article was Ian's work. I mean, I wouldn't like to go into the details about them because, for very good reason, they've kept the names anonymous for any number of reasons. In terms of my follow-up report, of course, I did actually speak to Iraqis who were willing to say that this sort of thing was going on, at least in terms of the idea of the British Army targeting civilians. Obviously, they can't give much insight into what kind of orders were being given and what kind of rules of engagement there were, but in terms of the actual kind of impact of it, they have plenty of stories to tell and are happy to go on the record about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's talk about that impact, because not only is it, of course, we're talking about people actually losing their lives, it's also about the impact of the British Army's role in Iraq and its occupation of Basra in particular that is affected by all of this. So, Alex, tell us about the people, the Iraqis you spoke to in the follow-up report, and what they were telling you about their time in terms of the reference, the time frame that we're talking about here, and what was happening.
Well, I mean, the Iraqis I spoke to, and I've been to Iraq quite recently a few times, including Basra. I mean, Iraqis I've spoken to, they're still very heavily, resentful towards a lot of the actions of the British Army there. One of the people I spoke to in reference to this recent report specifically spoke about what he described as indiscriminate targeting of civilians in Basra as early as, even during the kind of periods when the initial invasion was still ongoing, rather than the occupation period and onwards. And others have spoken about, to teenagers, children being targeted for seemingly, for no reason, not holding any weapons. So they're very willing to back up these reports. And of course, their other issue, one of their issues, of course, is the lack of accountability there's been since then, and the inability of a lot of them to actually find out detailed information about what the circumstances of loved ones who have been killed or disappeared.
Yeah, you spoke to a gentleman called Salim who still lives in Basra, and this is a direct quote from Salim from your article. I was one of the people who were targeted while I was walking on Al Zubair Bridge, that area in Basra. They being the British soldiers, targeted passers-by with bullets. There were a lot of civilians in the area. This was in April 2003, as you say, just pretty much at the start of the British involvement there. The British were killing anyone, he says, who was just walking around. Charles, and then Muntazar al-Zaidi, who's that journalist who in 2008 threw a shoe at President George W. Bush. He says, again in Alex's article, this is cheap and low and reminds us of the mentality and ethics of the medieval ages. The British Army is militarily modern, but it is humanely and morally backward. The effect of the British Army's occupation and these sort of tactics being employed, this kind of advice being given to soldiers to allow them to target these sorts of innocent civilians. What has that done to the British, and what did it do to the British forces while they were there trying to carry out their orders?
Well, of course, this has not just on the impact, shall we say, psychologically on British soldiers in terms of the effects of them after the war, and many of those have spoken about that, including the article. Of course, there are huge reputational issues as well. The British Army likes to pride itself on being highly professional, and I think generally it is. I can't speak for those specific incidents you mentioned because obviously I wasn't there, none of us was there. But they deserve, all of them deserve proper independent and thorough investigation. And the problem is that to a large degree that hasn't happened so far. You've had situations where it's the British military police that have largely been responsible for investigating these matters. Then when the historic inquiries team has taken over, which has involved civilian police, you've then had, it must be said, and this has been found even by the regulatory bodies, those that govern solicitors and lawyers in the UK, you've had situations where people have come forward with claims that they were abused, mistreated by British soldiers, and largely it would appear in terms of seeking compensation from the British Army and the British government. And then very spectacularly, unfortunately, those claims have been shown to be woefully false. And indeed, there's been disciplinary action even against British lawyers as a result of pursuing those cases. And the effect of that is really to discredit generally the whole idea that the British Army acted unlawfully in this way. I've no doubt, and I think most former British soldiers will have no doubt that in some instances, the British troops, as American troops and indeed troops of almost all countries, under battle situations, and even in some cases, we know of many cases, in fact, in Iraq and Afghanistan, where even not in battle situations, so they haven't got that excuse of the panic and the last-minute thinking, have gone well beyond what their legal rights were to actually commit human rights abuses, including murder. And the problem is now that because this has been overstated in some ways over the last couple of years in some instances, there is now very little political appetite, I think, in the United Kingdom, certainly not amongst the media, to pursue these kind of allegations. And it might be that some time has to pass before this legacy of these mass claims being made, which have been proven in court to be false, to pass so that then investigations can continue. And there will be hope for the future. Let's face it, at the moment, people are being prosecuted or at least investigated even for offences that were committed 30 to 40 years ago in the British Army, for example, in Northern Ireland. And so it may be that just because nothing's happened so far, that it won't happen in the future. The pressure needs to be kept up, and with proper sound investigations, such as the article we're talking about.
Charles, as a former British Army officer, how clear are the rules of engagement with civilians, unarmed people who are not wearing military uniforms?
Well, they are quite clear. And the problem here isn't that the rules of engagement were wrong necessarily. It's that the rules of engagement were informally, that's to say, just by the word of senior officers, according to the report, relaxed in a way that doesn't seem to have been sanctioned, shall we say, in writing at least, so that it would appear that nobody's held accountable for them. So, for example, if we look at the rules of engagement, it doesn't say that you can only engage people who are in uniform. It doesn't even say that you can only engage people who are carrying a weapon. So you could be unarmed yourself, but you can be on a mobile phone or a radio or with a pair of binoculars, and you can be calling down artillery, mortar or rocket fire. The laws of war, the international humanitarian law, for example, takes account of that. For example, the ICRC, the Red Cross, which largely manages or oversees the laws of war, at least to a large degree, they even make clear that a non-combatant will lose their non-combatant status the moment they participate in hostilities. That doesn't need to say necessarily with a weapon themselves. So there can be a case, of course, where people can be lawfully engaged, even though they're unarmed, even though they're not in a uniform. For example, the uniform aspect, any terrorist isn't going to wear a uniform usually, for example. The problem comes when those rules were relaxed, according to the report and according to the witnesses in the report, who state that they were then told by senior officers, actually now you don't have to have suspicion that they're taking part in hostilities. You can engage anybody with a mobile phone, anybody with a shovel. And it's quite obviously conceivable that in very great number of examples, probably the majority of examples, people carrying mobile phones, people carrying shovels in a Middle Eastern country or indeed any country are not overwhelmingly, in the majority of cases, going to be people worthy of engagement. And then as soon as you, shall we say, loosen those rules of engagement in that way, you undermine them and you give carte blanche to possibly a small minority of people who then will either not have proper fire discipline in a battle situation or simply, as in all professions, perhaps more, the army more than most, attracts its fair share of psychopaths and people who want to exercise power over those that don't have it, including killing, maiming and otherwise abusing them. And as I say, what this is, it really counts to is an absolute failure of management and leadership on the part of the officers and the senior, the non-commissioned officers who were managing those soldiers.
Okay, Alex, let me, on your behalf, on behalf of the Middle East Eye, and also on our behalf here on TRT World, say that we've both approached the Ministry of Defence in London and we haven't received any reply. So just confirm for me, Alex, if you have still not received a reply, because we haven't, really leading into the issue of whether there's a government cover-up going on here. Okay, in the report introducing this discussion, that Iraq Historic Allegations team that was set up in 2010 by the Labour government, when that was closed overnight, its outstanding cases went from 34,400 outstanding cases to suddenly overnight 20. That suggests, at least, some sort of cover-up or sweeping something under the carpet. Alex?
Yeah, well, as you said, no, we haven't had any response from the Ministry of Defence yet. In terms of a cover-up, I mean, I think this is a mixture of things. I mean, it's a mixture of, as Charles was saying, a very kind of politicised atmosphere in which any kind of attempt to be seen to investigate the armed forces has very, you get very little political capital out of that. It's very much seen as a kind of an anti-nationalist sort of unpatriotic sort of act. And there's also a mixture of an element of just an inability now, this time after the war, considering it was a war setting and it was a rather chaotic one, to actually maintain the kind of evidence needed. But I mean, there's also a degree of incompetence involved in terms of actually trying to take these issues to court. I mean, I know someone in Basra, for example, a guy called Salam al-Maliki, whose son was basically abducted or taken by British soldiers during the occupation and disappeared. And to this day, he's not been able to get any information from the Ministry of Defence or Home Office or anyone or Foreign Office about his whereabouts. And plenty of other historic allegations like that are still, they're still floating around out there. So, I mean, in terms of a cover-up, I mean, I would just say it's a mixture of incompetence and a lack of political will, if anything.
Senior British politicians from the governing party in the UK at the moment have criticised those who have been pursuing these sorts of allegations we're talking about. They've been called unscrupulous. Their actions are said have been described as being enemies of justice. Theresa May, the current Prime Minister, has criticised activist, left-wing human rights lawyers. Let's leave the politics aside. Charles, a final question to you. You've been in combat situations. In terms of what's alleged to have happened in Iraq, in 2003, it's still one of the most enduring controversies of the British presence in the country. 6 British soldiers in a police station not far from Basra were killed by insurgents. How much might something like that condition a soldier who's coming later into the country in terms of their fear and their understanding of the environment into which they're arriving, which might make it easier for them to carry this sort of alleged advice to kill innocent people?
Soldiers are human at the end of the day. I've seen it even in, for example, Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom itself, where if we went into patrolling, for example, in an area where people had carried out abuses, soldiers of the civilian population in the past, that's to say just beating them up, stealing their possessions and so on, it made the whole population, of course, turn up against the soldiers. And then, for example, vice versa was also the case. If a bomb went off, you saw a situation where, of course, 1 or 2 soldiers would be killed, more likely many badly injured. And, of course, a lot of soldiers, being human, would then naturally want to take it out on the entire population. And I'm sure that was happening in Afghanistan and in Iraq as well. The problem is, this is where it comes down to leadership. Management officers are paid and trained to manage properly. And when they turn a blind eye, or even worse, encourage or give license to the excesses of their soldiers, these kind of incidents happen where abuses take place. And of course, in the long run, it's counterproductive. It defeats the mission's aim and indeed turns the population generally against the soldiers who are either liberating or occupying them, depending on your perspective. And so it's probably in everybody's interest that the genuine cases here of abuse, and undoubtedly there will be many of those, are in time properly investigated and those that carried them out held to account, not least to prevent these things happening in the future.
Charles, Alex, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. We appreciate it. Still to come on the programme, will Egypt's Abdel Fattah al-Sisi become president for life? We debate whether the constitution should be changed. Also, did Swedish police abuse this pregnant woman on the metro? We ask if it was racism. The Egyptian people filled Tahrir Square in 2011 demanding freedom and democracy. President Hosni Mubarak's reign would not survive the Arab Spring. 3 decades without term limits ended in a revolution. So, did Mubarak's end give Egyptians the right to a representative government? Well, the country's first democratically elected president was ousted in a coup, and the former head of the army, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, came to power. His supporters are now playing a familiar tune, and Parliament has proposed a change in the constitution that would allow Sisi to remain in office until 2034. Yola Abdel has more.
Last year, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi won an election with 97% of the vote. The triumph was tempered by the turnout, just 41%, and accusations of fixing the result. After 4 years in control, he's accused of staging a security crackdown, which has killed thousands of people and put tens of thousands in prison. Sisi has denied allegations by Human Rights Watch that there are 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt, but seemed unsettled when interviewed in New York last September.
We are trying to stand against extremists who impose their ideology on the people. Now they are subject to a fair trial, and it may take years, but we have to follow the law.
Mr. President, the organization Human Rights Watch says that there are 60,000 political prisoners that you're holding today as we sit here.
I don't know where they got that figure.
It was uncomfortable enough for the Egyptian government to ask for the interview not to be broadcast. CBS refused the request. To help him run the Arab world's most populous country, Sisi does have powerful supporters who endorse him.
We've done very well. If you look at various parts of the Middle East, you look at Syria, we've wiped out ISIS, we're in the very final throes, but you have really been outstanding, and we will work with you, and we will go all the way. Thank you very much. Great job.
He's also met Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and many European leaders. French President Emmanuel Macron was the latest to visit Cairo in January. A red carpet was rolled out, followed by a military parade to inspect. Then a tour of Sisi's pet project, building a new capital city in the desert. Macron is quoted reminding the Egyptian president that stability and security cannot be separated from human rights. Sisi is the African Union's newly appointed chairman and seems happy with his international standing. He was given the gavel at the recent summit in Addis Ababa, less than 5 years since Egypt was kicked out of the 55-nation body, after the democratically elected Mohamed Morsi was removed in a coup.
Counterterrorism requires the identification of those who support and finance it, and combating them collectively. While we are aware of the difficulty and complexity of the struggle, this remains the only appropriate way to uproot terrorism and eradicate it.
Egypt is still battling an expensive and prolonged anti-terror campaign in the Sinai. Sisi's iron rule shows no sign of waning. But how much are his tactics, austerity measures, greater scrutiny of people, and an unpopular decision to cede 2 islands to Saudi Arabia leading to a decline in his popularity? Yolo Abdel, the Newsmakers.
Let's bring in our panel from London. Mustafa Ragab is the director and founder of Egyptian Affairs UK, and Ali Al-Kabani is the former general manager of the Islamic Press Agency. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers, gentlemen. Ali, let's start with you. Former Nobel Prize winner, once considered a man who could have been president of Egypt, Mohammed al-Baradei, has said that this is the Arab Spring in reverse. What do you think?
One of the main goals of the Blessed Revolution of January was to limit the terms of the president so we don't have in the future another Mubarak or another military dictator who stay forever or until he dies in office. So the Constitution of 2012 and that of 2014 insisted in clause 140 of 2 terms for the president and 4 years for each term. And then clause 226 came and prevented anybody from changing or extending the period where the president could serve. So it's only 2 terms. So now we are hearing about changes in the Constitution to allow Sisi to stay for another 12 years until 2034. So we are back to square one, and this clause, if approved, then it will end the last goal and target of the Blessed Revolution of January. So in short, the military rulers never respected a constitution. This constitution was drafted by Sisi's men, but they couldn't actually extend the period of the presidency because the revolution was still alive in the thoughts of the people, but they tried to do it now. The other thing is, even if there is changes, and even if it's legal and constitutional, how it could be applied backdated to Abdel Fattah Sisi, while the constitution he was elected at dictate that he can only have 2 terms, 4 years each.
Okay.
Another point. Why now we do...
Okay, Mustafa, pick up on some of their points. Don't worry, Ali, we've got plenty of time. We've got plenty of time, Ali. Mustafa, pick up on some of those points.
Yes, I'll have the answer for some of his questions. But let us first say, let's not make a big meal out of it, because it's only a proposal from some member of parliament, and it's not for definite. It's not over. It's not
yes, but the next step. Come on, Mustafa. We know the next step is almost a formality. Those who have to approve this are mostly supporters of Sisi, and it looks as if it's going to happen.
Well, everything has to go according to the will of the people.
And it should be discussed for 60 days. It didn't take 3 days.
But let me tell you something to start with. It is only an attack on President Sisi. President Sisi has got nothing to do with this. It's member of parliament proposing this thing. And what I look at now, an answer to the questions that my friend have put there, the present time now that Egypt lives in a very dangerous time. And the projects that started, the government started in Egypt now, and the fight against terrorism, when you look around, who's going to carry out this project and who's going to carry out these fights? It's very, very important that we look at these things before we look at someone staying for another term or another 2 terms. What we should put in mind is the safety of Egypt, is the future of Egypt, not the names who are ruling Egypt. We're not looking for a dictator, definitely. We're not going to look for someone who stay there forever, definitely. But we have to look at the situation that Egypt living in now, the projects that is going in Egypt, the fight against terrorism. We don't want another Libya or another Syria or another Iraq. We want Egypt to remain the same as it is now, safe for the people to live in and prosperous with the economy. Like we're seeing now, everything is coming up in Egypt. That is an answer to the question that you put forward.
Okay, Mustafa, I think there are 2 very important points there that Mustafa makes, Ali. So let's address these. There are 2 great challenges for Abdel Fattah al-Sisi: terrorism and the economy. Okay, terrorism is something that he can deal with, and he does seem to have dealt with it fairly successfully. Of course, you can argue with the methods. The economy is something that possibly might also depend on the outside world. But let's take terrorism. He's been successful at that. Mustafa seems to be suggesting that the only person who can continue to fight terrorism in Egypt is Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Is that correct, Ali? Would you agree?
This is absolutely wrong, because the challenge of the terrorism is for the country of Egypt, not a single individual. The other thing is why the American Congress did not change the American Constitution to allow George W. Bush to stay until he finished the war against Al-Qaeda. Life goes on. President comes and goes, but it is the country's duty.
Why did the British people allow Margaret Thatcher to stay for 16 years?
Okay.
Can you answer this question?
Because she won. She
did the British
legitimately
people
won
allow
elections.
Margaret
Hold on.
Thatcher
Okay.
to stay for
Okay. Hold on
16
one
years?
second, both of you. Okay. You'll both get a chance, but if you talk over each other, then I'm going to talk over the both of you. Okay. So Margaret Thatcher was elected properly, free and fair elections, and we'll come on to Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's 2 election victories in a moment. Ali, just finish that train of thought about who's the best person to fight terrorism.
I also don't think that your other guests understand the difference between presidential system and parliamentary system. Parliamentary system is the party rules when the party get a majority in parliament, and the leader of that party stays as prime minister. But even Margaret Thatcher, her own party got rid of her because they don't want. You have a presidential system, so it's only 2 terms and he can go. It's not a parliamentary system when a prime minister can stay.
Okay.
So you have to know the difference. And Egypt chose.
Can you take his place?
I mean.
Can you take his place?
Egypt has got 100 million people.
Oh, you can only talk.
Of course, any idiot can take his place.
Okay, listen, that's not a fair question. Ali's not putting himself up. Ali's not putting himself up for president. Ali, look, let me just take this over for a moment. Okay, because Mustafa, you say that, you know, why did Maggie Thatcher stay in power for all those years? She won her elections free and fair. Many people have wondered whether 2014 and 2018 were completely free and fair. Okay, first of all, turnout in both those elections was below 50%. That says something possibly about the popularity of Sisi. He won by 96.1% in 2014 and 97% in 2018.
What was the turnover in the UK? What was the turnover in the UK?
No, sorry, I don't understand.
That's about the turnover in every election.
Yeah, okay, that's absolutely fine. But it's quite rare for anybody to win an election with more than 90% of the vote. And then there are all of the political parties, it's such a long list, and all of the potential candidates who all pulled out of the running. He was hardly facing any sort of competition. Okay, so now the suggestion being, out of those results and the way he won the elections and the people he was not standing against, suggests that possibly he's not as popular as he himself portrays his presidency. So this makes these extensions of terms even more contentious.
Well, let the people of Egypt say that.
That's why actually
let the people of Egypt go out to the election boxes and say that.
They will say that, but
the
if they have no point, Mustafa, if they have no option, who are they going to choose? Okay, so I'll give you the list. Okay, 2014, the New Wafd Party, the Free Egyptians Party. They said that they wouldn't put up a candidate. The Noor Party did exactly the same. Then individuals, Adli Mansour, Abdul Manem Abul Futu, Ahmed Shafiq, General Sami Anan, Amir Musa, all of them, they refused to stand. He was hardly facing any sort of competition. If there's competition, he may not have got the results that he officially got. Mustafa.
The only one,
but Sami Anan was jailed.
Out of those names
Ahmed
that you
Shafiq was threatened.
That can be fit
for
for the
was
job
put in jail.
Is Amr Musa. But Amr Musa has given up
was put
since
in jail.
he lost the first election. I'm saying to you, the only name from all the names that you mentioned who can stand up for this position is Amr Musa. But he gave up after losing the first election. But the other names, I'm sorry, no one of them can fit for this position. When someone forged his ID card...
But why didn't you let the people decide?
Absolutely.
Why do you want to put Sami Anan in jail and deny him the right to put his name as a candidate? Or Konsoa?
Because he forged his ID card.
Genuine contender
because he forged
to
his
Sisi.
ID card. Because he forged his ID card.
I mean, really,
do you understand what's
in short, we can't discuss this nonsense. Since the coup d'etat of 1952,
do you want a crook to be the president of Egypt?
Listen to me.
I know you don't mind because
listen, you may learn something.
You yourself said any idiot can be the president. If you want an idiot to be the president, I'm sorry. Your conversation
we have
with
got a
you
real
is
idiot
just
now
no good.
who is a president for 8 years and he wants to be another 12 years. Listen, all the elections, according to Jihad Sadat in Egypt,
really
were fiddled.
Okay.
I think you're very nervous. You're very nervous. You're very agitated.
Okay, hold on, Mustafa. Hold on, please. Okay, Ali, go ahead.
Yeah, all those people supporting a military regime I am fed up from their stupid
What's wrong with the military regime? We do need a military regime. What have you got against the military regime that defending your country and defending your home and defending you? Where do we come about military regime?
Mustafa, you posed the question. You posed the question.
The military.
Let Ali at least respond to your question.
Military regimes are military
That's what it is.
Only in retarded country, in respected countries, military should not interfere in politics at all. Even retired general, there is a gap between leaving the service in the military army and being involved in political activities and being members of political parties. In Egypt, we are living under military dictatorship.
My friend, that does not apply for everybody. There's some countries that can only rule by the military.
Like that when only retarded countries.
You want to apply your system.
That Egypt
you
is
want to apply a system
country?
To all the countries of the world. That does not apply to everybody.
Listen,
yes.
Honestly, this is the third or fourth time. It's no discussion if you both talk at the same time. Mustafa, please, I'll come back to you in just a second. Ali, just take it for the next 30 or 40 seconds.
He wants to apply the system
Mustafa,
for every
please.
country in the world.
Please.
Every country of the world is different.
Okay. Let Ali respond to that, and then I'll come back to you. Ali.
Countries of the world are different, but the principle of democracy and the sovereignty of people is the same. And no respected, civilized, free, democratic country would allow a president to stay more than 8 years or 2 terms. Tell me, in one single country in the whole world, a president stayed above his terms or the parliament changed the constitution to allow him to extend his period as president? None. Only in retarded military countries in South America or Egypt or some retarded African countries, this takes place, but never in respected countries.
Okay.
Also, why the timing now? Sisi could have waited for 1 year before his second term end and do these changes. But he knows that the economy is going from bad to worse, and people will never vote for him and will never believe the failed result of his election that he won was 90%, while the majority of the Egyptian people refuse him and refuse his control. The other thing, actually, the changes proposed are going to put all the powers in the hand of Sisi. The judicial power, the judiciary power, so he can control the whole country. He will be a dictator above all dictators which we experience in the history of human being.
Okay.
And that is why I am against these changes, and Egyptian people, the majority of them, are against that change.
Okay, Ali, Mustafa, give me an opportunity to present a clip from 2017 of the president talking to the American CNBC network, where he was asked about presidential terms, and this is what he had to say.
It doesn't suit me as a president to stay one more day against the will of the Egyptians. This is not talk for TV. These are principles I embrace and I am keen on. I am with preserving 2 4-year terms and not to change it.
He said, I embrace these ideas. He's changed his mind.
Right.
Why has he changed his mind?
Right. There is two things I would say to you there. Number one, I just hope that President Sisi will come out and reject this proposal and shut everybody up. That's number one. Number two, yes, we are with the Constitution.
I challenge you.
Ali, please.
We have to look at the sensitive situation that our country is going through. I mean, he's saying, tell me who stayed in power. Turkey, look who's staying in power for so long. Everyone else is staying in power for so long. Why don't you object to this? But what we're looking at, you having a personal attack on President Sisi, that's all. Because he really hurt you all. All you kind of people hurt by President Sisi. That is why you hate him. But we love him. The Egyptian people love him for what he did to the country. Look at terrorism. Look at China. Look at the border with Libya. Look at all this. Do you understand what's going on there? Do you understand the lives that the Egyptian people lose every day to protect you and make your people in Egypt live safe? Do you understand what is happening with the economy in Egypt? All the buildings that is going up in Egypt? Do you understand the projects that is being going on there? If you do, then you would change your mind. But because you hate the person that called President Sisi, you would say anything right is wrong. That is what you do, you people. You don't look deeply to what is happening in Egypt. I do agree that the constitution should remain as it is. But if the people in Egypt, not me or you, Mr. Ali Kabani, living somewhere and attacking the president in Egypt, the people in Egypt should have the final say, not me or you.
Okay, now let's just address the economic issue here. Okay, youth unemployment from 2007 to 2017 has gone from 25% to 34%. The poverty rate has been increasing over the past decade, but the growth rate of GDP is not so discouraging, actually. From 2012 to 2022, it's expected to go from between 2.23 to 6%. Most countries at the moment with the global economic climate might be quite happy with that. And yet, Mustafa, you say you're happy with Egypt. Let me just read you a short little excerpt.
I am very happy, and I'll tell you why.
Are you happy with this?
Rate of unemployment.
Okay, are you happy with this?
You mentioned the rate of unemployment.
Okay,
I'm gonna address this point.
Yes, unemployment, yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I should have mentioned that. About 11%. Okay, about 11% is not too bad. Okay, I totally agree.
I'm gonna address this point for you, because young people in Egypt now became very choosy. And my proof for that, look at all the people that came over from Syria. They're working. Look at the people who came over from Sudan. They are working. But the young people in Egypt now choose to be very choosy, and they prefer to sit in cafeterias at night saying, I don't have a job.
Okay.
But people can work if they get up and work.
We're running out of time. We're running out of time.
The people who came to Egypt and finding work.
Okay, I was going to give you a short excerpt. Because we're running out of time, I'll summarize it into 2 words. Police state. Okay, there are a lot of analysts around the world who believe that Egypt is almost a police state. Okay, 30 seconds each. Ali?
Of course, it's a police state controlled by the army, and no opposition can dare to open their mouths, even from inside the military establishment themselves. You know, there was always an aura about the military officers that they are khayr agnadil, are the best of officers in the whole world. But then we saw what happened to Konsoa. He was humiliated. What happened to Sami Anan, the chief of staff, who said that he was corrupt.
You say to him 2 words, he goes for 100 words.
It is a police state. Listen to me, listen, and you will have time to talk.
Okay.
So Egypt have no future under the military regime, and the blessed revolution of January was to get rid of them once and for all.
Okay, thank you. 30 seconds, please, Mustafa.
Mr. Ali multiply his 2 words by 200 again to attack President Sisi.
Answer the question and leave Ali alone.
We need a police state to control people like Mr. Ali. We do need them desperately now.
That is a retarded thinking.
We need people to control Mr. Ali.
Who
goes out, really demolish Egypt and turn Egypt into what he wants to turn it. But Egypt will remain a great country, will remain as it is. You will never,
of course, Egypt will remain, and the military regime will go to hell.
In Egypt.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. Appreciate your time.
We want to decrease the amount of immigrants in general, but many of the immigrants that have come to Sweden in the last decades have been Muslims.
Sweden was once called a moral superpower for its welcoming treatment of migrants. But the right-wing party, the Swedish Democrats, is tapping into a growing mistrust of foreigners and a desire to keep the number of new arrivals down. Those concerns were encapsulated in one particular incident last week when video footage here showed security officers dragging a pregnant woman off a Stockholm metro, pinning her to a bench, stomach down. The police said she was travelling without a ticket and reacted angrily when they gave her a fine. Well, let's go to Stockholm now and speak to the activist and social media influencer, Lavette Jallow. Lavette, thank you very much indeed for your time. Now, you have spoken to eyewitnesses who were there on the platform at that metro station when this incident happened. What did they tell you?
I think if you guys probably don't speak Swedish, so you can't hear them very well, but they're saying, be careful, she's pregnant, stop what you're doing. So I've had several contacts with about 7 eyewitnesses, somewhere within the train, somewhere outside of the train. They've all stepped forward and given their witness basically for the lady that was in question in that video. They just felt that it was the way it was handled was very brutal, especially since they already knew she was pregnant and clutching her stomach.
What about her reaction and the police saying that she got angry. Presumably, that's their justification for manhandling her the way they did.
To clarify, the police have not come out with any report. The police are investigating her claim to being mistreated. So the police have not come out and said that she's been violent, and she has not been violent, which several people from within the train can testify to.
Has the reaction around Sweden been what you expected it to be?
It's what I expected it to be once I took it upon myself to discuss that this is not an isolated incident. This is something I've been speaking about on the public platforms for the last year.
Hold on, when you say it's what you expected it to be, do you mean you expected people to get angry about it, or you expected people to say, well, this kind of thing happens, it's okay?
No, I think that many people will say this kind of thing happens, let's just forget about it. But when I discuss these things, I come with statistics and facts that back up that this is not an isolated incident, and that actually enrages people to demand a change in our system, especially in the security guard profession, which we've had several incidents and several issues happening over the last couple of years and well before that.
Sorry, you say you back it up with statistics and facts. That suggests again, and I'm reading between the lines, that this thing happens more often than the outside world thinks. Because when the outside world looks at Sweden, and Livette, you know this, we all think Sweden is some kind of paradise.
Yes, I spent 10 years of my life living in England before coming back to Sweden, so I'm fully aware of what the outside thinks of Sweden. But they haven't really looked at the statistics that the police have given us, and as well as our Justice Department system. They release a study every year that gives you the statistics of how people are treated based on color here in Sweden. And Black people from the African diaspora are on the top list of violent hate crime in Sweden. That prompted a report in 2014 called the Afrophobia Report that went through the issues that we are facing here in Sweden. Maybe because we're mostly visible via our skin tone, but the reality is very different when you live in Sweden and have lived here for all of your life and you happen to be Black. So despite what the outside world thinks, it's not all peace and quiet here in Sweden. But a lot of it never reaches you or the outside world because media never snaps it up. Media never talks about it unless people like myself question them as to why they are silencing our issues here.
So again, looking at Sweden from the outside, this apparently exemplary model of social justice where the contract between the citizenry and the bureaucracy of government is a very strong one, that the government will take care of people as long as they behave, and they do overall, we believe, from the outside, seem to behave. But then you said this very interesting phrase. You said left or right anti-Blackness is countrywide. Just explain a bit more about that.
What I mean about that, we have a huge polarization in Sweden, but funnily enough, with my work as a public person, the people that are most likely to threaten me come not from the Swedish Democrats, but from what we call Vänster, which is the more liberal, the more democratic people. You will see them with banners and you will know how they vote, but the anti-Blackness rolls from both sides. There's a lot of ignorance that spins on both sides. So for me, it's irrelevant if they're right or left.
Okay.
There is an issue with anti-Blackness here in Sweden and worldwide.
Okay, so after this, the longest political standoff in Swedish political history, we have now this four-party alliance, which seems to have been created just to keep the right-wing Swedish Democrats out of power. They, the SD, getting 18% almost of the vote in last year's election. That suggests, are we wrong in looking at it, that the major political parties are doing everything they can to keep a party which many people say has Nazi tendencies out of power?
It's the same thing that's happening in Sweden has happened in America, and that there's a big misconception because when Black Americans speak about racism and the history of anti-Blackness, Trump is not the beginning and end of it. In Sweden, Jimmy Åkesson is not the beginning and the end of anti-Blackness. He's a symptomatic issue, but it goes much deeper than just him. He's just in charge of the rhetorics. But Sweden has a bigger issue in the system that we're coming out year after year with reports. We came out with another report a few months ago saying how blacks are discriminated. He is just a symptom of a much bigger problem in Sweden, which is that nobody is facing up to the facts of what certain people are facing, because migrants are not aliens here. Most of us are born here and we work here. Our families were born here.
Yeah,
but
and of course,
looked upon as outside the norm.
Sure, and this is a country that per capita has taken in more refugees than any other nation over the past few years. I'd like to end on a positive note, because there's a picture of you with that lady from the metro having had her baby, or she's just about to have her baby, right? And you were her doula. Did you know her before this incident? What happened in terms of making you that close to her that you're in hospital with her and her new baby?
I realized that people like her are not, there's a lot of people who are alone without family contact. And that is my main job. I run an NGO. I am there for people despite what their colors of their skin is. This incident brought us a little bit closer because she was actually at the brink of losing everything, at the brink of mental anguish and trauma, as with her kids. So I had to step in just as another human being that wanted to help, that wanted to be there financially and practically and help.
And how is she doing now?
Humanity.
How is she doing now? Was it a boy or a girl, and how's the baby?
It was a healthy baby boy that arrived a little bit too early, but is doing swimmingly right now.
Lavette, honestly, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the Newsmaker. Thank you very much indeed. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Adnan Nawaz. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember, as always, to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, thousands of Haitians tell President Jovenel Moïse to step down. We'll look at his response to growing protests about corruption and mismanagement. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.